In the frozen silence of a military hangar outside Moscow in the winter of 1945, a group of Soviet engineers stood before an aircraft that would shatter everything they thought they knew about aviation. This wasn't one of their Yaks or Lavochkins. This was a machine that seemed to defy the very laws of physics they had been taught. The North American P-51 Mustang, a gift from the Allies, a Trojan horse of knowledge. And as the lead engineer, Colonel Viktor Antonov, ran his weathered hand along the perfectly smooth wing surface, he whispered words that would echo through the corridors of Soviet aviation history. Comrades, we have been building tractors while they have been building symphonies. Before we dive into this incredible story of engineering revelation and Cold War awakening, drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from and what you think made the difference between Eastern and Western aviation during World War II. Now, let me tell you why this story matters. More than you might think. This isn't just about an airplane. This is about the moment when an entire nation's technological philosophy was exposed, when pride collided with reality, when engineers trained in Soviet pragmatism came face to face with Western precision, and when the seeds of the MiG-15, the aircraft that would challenge American supremacy in the Korean skies, were first planted in the minds of stunned Soviet designers. This is the story of how a single captured fighter plane became a mirror reflecting uncomfortable truths, and how that reflection changed the course of Cold War history. This is the moment the Soviet Union finally understood what air superiority really meant. Colonel Viktor Antonov was not a man easily impressed. At 43 years old, he had survived the Great Purge, the desperate early days of Operation Barbarossa, and the grinding brutality of the Eastern Front. He had designed modifications for the Yak-9 that saved countless Soviet pilots' lives. He had worked 18-hour days in factories relocated beyond the Ural Mountains, building fighters in conditions that would have broken lesser men. His hands were scarred from metalwork, his eyes permanently narrowed from years of examining blueprints in dim light, and his reputation within the Soviet aviation establishment was unassailable. Viktor was a true believer in Soviet ingenuity, in the doctrine that Russian engineering was defined by ruggedness, simplicity, and battlefield practicality. Elegant solutions were for peacetime. War demanded brutal efficiency. But Viktor also possessed something rare in Stalin's Soviet Union: intellectual honesty. He had seen too much, lost too many pilots, watched too many promising designs fail under combat conditions to indulge in comfortable delusions. When his superiors assigned him to lead the technical examination team for the captured American fighter, he approached it with the same methodical skepticism he brought to every project. He expected to find clever solutions, perhaps, but also the weaknesses inherent in capitalist manufacturing, the compromises of a nation that had never fought for survival on its own soil. He expected to confirm what Soviet doctrine had always maintained, that American aircraft were over-engineered, fragile, unsuited for the harsh realities of real combat. He expected vindication. He would get revelation instead. The P-51D Mustang sat in the center of Hangar 7 at the Kubinka test facility like a sculpture of impossible grace. Its serial number, barely visible in the harsh overhead lights, read 4473149. It had been acquired through channels that Viktor knew better than to question. Officially, it was part of a technical exchange program with the Allies. Unofficially, everyone understood that in the chaos of Germany's collapse, many things changed hands, and not all transfers were documented in official protocols. The aircraft bore the scars of combat, patches on the fuselage where German rounds had found their mark. But it had been repaired with meticulous care by whoever had possessed it last. Viktor's team assembled around the Mustang on that January morning in 1946. 6 of the Soviet Union's finest aviation engineers, handpicked from design bureaus across the country. There was Dmitry Volkov, the aerodynamics specialist from the Yakovlev Bureau, a thin man with intellectual arrogance written across his narrow face. There was Pavel Sokolov from Lavochkin, built like a tank himself, who believed that aircraft should be simple enough for a conscript with 3 weeks of training to repair in a foxhole. There was young Alexei Fedorov, barely 30, a rising star in propulsion systems, whose father had been executed in 1937 for wrecking, and whose own loyalty was perpetually questioned because of that stain. And there were 3 others, each brilliant, each carrying the distinctive Soviet mixture of pride, paranoia, and profound competence forged in the crucible of total war. "So this is the famous American fighter," Dmitry said, his tone dripping with practiced skepticism as he circled the aircraft. "The one their propaganda claims won the air war in Europe. It looks fragile to me. That long nose, those thin wings. How does it not tear itself apart in a dive? Where is the armor? Where is the redundancy?" His questions came rapid fire, each one an accusation disguised as technical inquiry. Pavel grunted agreement, rapping his knuckles against the fuselage. Thin. Too thin. One burst from a German cannon and this would disintegrate. Our Lavochkins can take punishment. This is a rich man's toy, not a weapon of war. Viktor said nothing yet. He was looking at the wings. Something about their shape unsettled him, though he couldn't articulate why. They were unlike anything in Soviet aviation, smooth to a degree that seemed almost unnatural. The surface so perfect it felt like touching glass. There were no rivets protruding, no rough edges, no signs of the hurried, brutal construction he was accustomed to. Every panel fit with microscopic precision. This wasn't just an aircraft. This was a statement. Comrades, Viktor finally spoke, his voice carrying the authority of experience. Reserve your conclusions. We will approach this systematically. First, we document everything. Every measurement, every material, every design choice. Then we test. Then, and only then, do we judge. The Great Patriotic. War taught us that underestimating an enemy's capabilities is the fastest path to defeat. We will not repeat that mistake with their technology. But even as Viktor spoke those measured words, he felt the first stirrings of something he hadn't experienced in years. Doubt. Not in Soviet capabilities broadly, but in the specific assumptions that had guided Soviet aviation design throughout the war. The Mustang's very presence challenged doctrines he had helped establish, principles he had defended. In countless meetings with skeptical generals and suspicious party officials. The examination began with the wings, because the wings were where the Mustang's strangeness was most pronounced. In Soviet fighters, wings were sturdy, thick, designed to support heavy armament and absorb battle damage. They were engineering compromises, trading some aerodynamic efficiency for ruggedness and payload capacity. The Mustang's wings were different. They were thin, almost delicate in appearance, with a shape that Dmitry, the aerodynamic specialist, immediately recognized as something he had only read about in theoretical papers. Laminar-flow, Dmitry whispered, his skepticism momentarily overwhelmed by professional fascination. They actually implemented laminar-flow at production scale. We thought it was theoretically possible, but the manufacturing precision required. He trailed off, running measuring instruments along the wing's leading edge, checking and rechecking his readings with increasing agitation. The tolerances here are impossible. Look at this surface smoothness. There are no imperfections larger than a fraction of a millimeter across the entire span. Our factories cannot achieve this. Our manufacturing doctrine does not even contemplate this level of precision. Viktor watched his colleague's face transform from arrogance to confusion to something approaching awe. Laminar flow was the holy grail of aerodynamic efficiency, a design approach where air flowed smoothly over the wing surface without the turbulent boundary layer that created drag and limited performance. Soviet engineers understood the theory perfectly, but theory and implementation were separated by a chasm of manufacturing capability. Building a laminar flow wing required machining precision, quality control, and industrial coordination that Soviet factories built for wartime mass production and operated by workers with minimal training simply could not match. Calculate the drag coefficient, Viktor ordered quietly. I want to know exactly how much more efficient this wing is compared to our designs. Over the next 3 hours, as Dmitry worked through the mathematics, the rest of the team continued their examination. Pavel discovered that the thin fuselage actually contained more internal fuel capacity than a Yak-9 despite being smaller in overall dimensions. The packaging efficiency was extraordinary, every cubic centimeter utilized with surgical precision. Alexei, examining the Packard-built Merlin engine, found himself staring at machining tolerances and assembly precision that exceeded anything in Soviet aircraft production. This engine, Alexei said slowly, his usual confidence shaken, has tighter tolerances than our experimental prototypes. But this is a production aircraft. They built thousands of these. How did they achieve mass production with precision we reserve for hand-built demonstration models? The question hung in the cold air of the hangar, unanswered and troubling. By the end of that first day, Viktor's team had compiled measurements and observations that fundamentally challenged their understanding of aviation engineering. But numbers on paper were abstract. The Mustang needed to fly. Only in the air would its true nature be revealed. Only in the sky would the full scope of Western air superiority become undeniable. The test flight was scheduled for 3 days later, giving Viktor's team time to complete their ground examination and brief the test pilot on what to expect. The pilot chosen for this honor was Major Konstantin Ivanov, A war hero with 14 confirmed kills, and a reputation for being able to evaluate an aircraft's characteristics with uncanny precision, Kostya had flown German Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs captured during the Soviet advance westward. He had compared them unfavorably to Soviet designs, noting their complexity and maintenance demands as fatal flaws for Eastern Front conditions. Viktor briefed Kostya personally in his cramped office the evening before the flight. "What do you expect from this American machine?" Viktor asked, genuinely curious about the pilot's intuition. Kostya shrugged, his weathered face impassive. "I expect it to fly well in clean conditions, to be fast in a straight line, perhaps good at altitude where our aircraft struggle. But I also expect it to be unforgiving, to demand gentle handling, to be unsuited for combat maneuvering. Americans fight from altitude and speed. We fight in the mud. Different philosophies, different machines. And if your expectations are wrong..." Kostya smiled thinly. "Then I will tell you so, Comrade Colonel. I fly airplanes, not propaganda." The morning of January 15, 1946, dawned cold and crystalline clear over Kubinka. The Mustang had been fueled and prepared according to American specifications found in a partially translated manual. Viktor's entire team assembled on the flight line, along with several high-ranking officers from the aviation ministry whose presence made everyone nervous. Among them was General Andrei Volsky, a thick-necked man whose career had been built on political reliability rather than technical competence, and who viewed the examination of American technology with undisguised hostility. "I hope this demonstration will confirm what we already know," General Volsky announced to no one in particular, his voice carrying across the frozen apron. "That Soviet aviation is superior in all aspects that matter for real combat. The Americans had resources, yes, numbers, yes, but not quality, not warrior spirit. These things cannot be engineered." Viktor said nothing but exchanged a glance with Dmitri. They both knew that if the Mustang performed as their preliminary analysis suggested, General Volsky's comfortable certainties were about to collide with uncomfortable reality. Kostya climbed into the cockpit with practiced efficiency. But Viktor noticed the pilot taking extra time to familiarize himself with the controls. The Mustang's cockpit was different from Soviet designs, more spacious, with better visibility, instruments arranged with ergonomic logic that contrasted sharply with the cramped, functional chaos of Soviet fighter cockpits. The canopy, when Kostya closed it, was a bubble of optical quality plexiglass that provided almost unobstructed vision in all directions. Soviet pilots fought partially blind by comparison. There, visibility restricted by heavy framing and armored glass. The Merlin engine coughed, caught, and then settled into a smooth, powerful roar that was subtly different from the more agricultural sound of Soviet inline engines. Even at idle, the Mustang radiated mechanical refinement. Kostya taxied to the runway, completed his pre-flight checks with methodical care, and then pushed the throttle forward. What happened next would be discussed in Soviet aviation circles for decades. The Mustang accelerated down the runway with startling rapidity, lifted off in what seemed like impossibly short distance, and climbed at an angle that made several observers gasp audibly. Kostya had been briefed to conduct a standard evaluation profile. Straight and level flight at various speeds and altitudes, basic maneuvers, approach and landing. But even in these simple exercises, the Mustang's capabilities became immediately, undeniably apparent. Viktor watched through binoculars as Kostya climbed to 8,000 meters in what seemed like minutes rather than the grinding ascent Soviet fighters required. At altitude, the Mustang didn't struggle, didn't lose performance, didn't become sluggish and difficult to control. Instead, it seemed to come alive, more responsive and capable than it had been at low altitude. This was fundamentally alien to Soviet aviation experience, where altitude was enemy, where engines gasped and performance degraded, where pilots fought their aircraft rather than flew them. "Impossible," Dmitri muttered beside Viktor. "At that altitude, that temperature, with that thin air, the aircraft should be barely controllable. Look at the control surface deflections. Minimal. It's flying as if at sea level." The radio crackled with Kostya's voice, professional but with an undercurrent of something Viktor had never heard from the veteran pilot before. Excitement. "Kubinka control, test aircraft, reaching 10,000 meters, engine temperature nominal, control. Response exceptional. Beginning maneuver sequence." What followed was a demonstration that progressively demolished every assumption Soviet engineers held about high-altitude fighter performance. Kostya executed rolls, loops, hard turns, high-speed dives and climbs that would have left a Yak-9 shuddering and on the edge of structural failure or control loss. The Mustang performed each maneuver with balletic grace, the aircraft responding to control inputs with precision and predictability that seemed almost supernatural. There was no fighting the aircraft, no wrestling with adverse characteristics, no compromises. The pilot commanded, and the machine obeyed with absolute fidelity. General Volsky's expression had progressed from confidence to confusion, to something approaching alarm. "This is altitude, you understand," he said to Viktor, his tone defensive. "We build our fighters for low-altitude combat on the Eastern Front. Different requirements. This proves nothing about real combat. Effectiveness." But Viktor wasn't listening to the general's rationalizations. He was watching Kostya execute a sustained turn at high altitude that would have been impossible for any Soviet fighter. The Mustang maintaining energy and control throughout a maneuver that should have bled speed and ended in a stall. He was realizing, with the clarity of revelation, that this wasn't about different design philosophies or different operational requirements. This was about capability gap. This was about an opponent who had solved engineering problems that Soviet aviation hadn't even properly articulated yet. 45 minutes into the flight, Kostya's voice came over the radio again. "Kubinka control. I need to discuss fuel state. According to instruments, I have consumed approximately 40% of internal fuel. If these readings are accurate, I could remain airborne for another hour at combat power, or considerably longer at cruise settings. I have never flown a single-engine fighter with this endurance." Dmitry grabbed Viktor's arm, his face pale. "Did you hear that? 40% fuel consumption after 45 minutes of aggressive maneuvering at altitude. Our fighters would be nearly empty. This machine has strategic range. It can escort bombers deep into enemy territory and still fight all the way home. We have nothing comparable. Nothing even close." The full implication settled over Viktor like a physical weight. Range meant options. Range meant the ability to choose when and where to fight. Range meant bombers didn't have to fly alone, didn't have to face enemy fighters without protection, didn't have to accept horrific losses as the inevitable cost of strategic bombing. The Americans and British had built a fighter that could reach into the heart of enemy territory, maintain combat effectiveness at altitudes where most fighters struggled to fly at all, and return home with fuel to spare. Soviet fighters, for all their ruggedness and battlefield practicality, were tactical weapons, tied to forward airfields, limited in range and altitude capability, unable to project power beyond the immediate front lines. This was what air superiority really meant. Not just having more aircraft or braver pilots. Having aircraft that could dominate the entire operational space, that could impose their will on the enemy's timeline and geography, that could turn air combat from a grinding battle of attrition into a strategic instrument of precise, overwhelming power. Kostya landed the Mustang 30 minutes later, the touchdown smooth and controlled despite the aircraft's high wing loading and unfamiliar handling characteristics. When he climbed out of the cockpit, his expression was complex, a mixture of professional admiration and something darker, something that looked like loss. Viktor met him on the flight line, away from the general and the other officials. "Tell me truthfully, Kostya. Compare it to our best fighters." The pilot was silent for a long moment, choosing his words carefully. "Comrade Colonel, I have flown the Yak-3, the Lavochkin La-7, the best aircraft our designers have created. I have loved them like brothers, trusted them with my life, achieved victory in them against skilled enemies. But this American machine..." He paused, looking back at the Mustang, its silver paint gleaming in the weak winter sun. "This is from a different generation of aviation. It's not that it's better in one area or another. It's that it operates at a different level of refinement, capability, and strategic potential. Our fighters are magnificent for what they were designed to do. But the Americans designed for a different war entirely, and they solved problems we didn't even know we had." Viktor nodded slowly. This was the confirmation he had dreaded and expected. "Write your full evaluation. Be honest. The political implications are not your concern." But politics were Viktor's concern, and he knew that the truth his team had discovered would be difficult, perhaps dangerous, to communicate up the Soviet hierarchy. Admitting technological inferiority to the capitalist West, acknowledging that Soviet methods had produced inferior results, questioning the doctrine of Soviet superiority. These were not merely technical conclusions, they were ideological heresies. Over the following weeks, as Viktor's team completed their comprehensive analysis, the depth of the Mustang's technological sophistication became ever more apparent. The laminar-flow wing alone represented a quantum leap in aerodynamic efficiency. Dmitry calculated that it reduced drag by nearly 25% compared to comparable Soviet wing designs, directly translating into longer range, higher speed, and better altitude performance. But achieving laminar flow required not just sophisticated design, but manufacturing precision across hundreds of production facilities, quality control systems that caught defects measured in fractions of millimeters, and supply chains that delivered consistent materials to exact specifications. This was systems-level engineering at a scale Soviet industry had never approached. The engine told a similar story. Alexei's detailed examination of the Packard-built Merlin revealed machining tolerances so tight that Soviet factories would have rejected the specifications as impossible. Yet this engine had been mass-produced by the thousands, installed not just in Mustangs but in other Allied aircraft, maintained by mechanics with standardized training, and serviced with interchangeable parts that actually were interchangeable, a concept that remained theoretical in Soviet aviation logistics. Pavel, examining the fuel system, discovered bladder tanks that were self-sealing, leak-proof, and flexible enough to maximize usable internal volume. Soviet fighters used rigid metal tanks that were heavier, more vulnerable to combat damage, and less efficient in their use of space. The EOS American system represented materials science, manufacturing capability, and design integration that Soviet engineers understood theoretically but could not replicate practically. Even small details revealed philosophical differences. The cockpit instrumentation was backlit for night operations, something Soviet fighters lacked. The gun sight was computing, automatically adjusting for target lead and range, while Soviet sights were still fixed reflector types requiring pilot calculation. The radio was clear, reliable, and operated on frequencies that allowed long-range communication, unlike Soviet radios that were notoriously unreliable and short-ranged. Every system, every component, every design choice reflected an approach to aviation that prioritized pilot effectiveness, mission success, and operational flexibility in ways that Soviet design philosophy, shaped by desperation, resource scarcity, and doctrine built for short-range tactical combat, had never considered. Viktor compiled all of this into a comprehensive report, knowing that its conclusions would be unwelcome at best, potentially dangerous at worst. He titled it simply Technical Analysis of American P-51D Fighter Aircraft, and spent 3 days writing and rewriting his summary, trying to find language that communicated truth without appearing to criticize Soviet aviation too directly, that acknowledged American superiority without suggesting Soviet inferiority, an impossible balance that kept him awake. Nights in his small apartment, staring at the ceiling and wondering if honesty was a luxury he could afford. The report was submitted through proper channels, and for 2 weeks, Viktor heard nothing. Then came a summons to Moscow, to a meeting at the Ministry of Aviation Industry. Attendance required. Purpose unspecified. Viktor traveled to the capital with growing apprehension, carrying his technical data and prepared for the worst. The meeting room was large, wood-paneled, dominated by a long table where a dozen officials already sat waiting when Viktor arrived. General Volsky was there, his expression hostile. But there were also other faces, designers Viktor recognized from photographs, Artem Mikoyan from the MiG Design Bureau, Semyon Lavochkin whose fighters Viktor had helped develop, Alexander Yakovlev whose aircraft had formed the backbone of Soviet fighter production. These were men who understood aviation at the deepest level, who would recognize truth when they saw it, who might be allies rather than interrogators. At the head of the table sat a man Viktor didn't recognize. Civilian dress, cold eyes, the unmistakable aura of NKVD authority. His presence transformed the meeting from technical review to something far more dangerous.